President Volodymyr Zelensky is just about ready to wrap up his American tour, where he came to the United Nations General Assembly. It started off with this big famous place at a Pennsylvania weapons factory, which landed him in no short amount of hot water politically in the United States, unbeknownst to him, I don't think, and has ended kind of in a different place with a visit with presidential candidate Trump, which we're going to show you here in a little bit. All in all, this was a really big failure for Zelensky, and we're going to talk graphically why that is. But you're also going to see some really strange disconnect from reality about the language that's being used. And we have a great guest to help us unpack some of this today and Rod, kind of get at what's going on here, because there's some bigger issues than you may even realize beneath the surface. And that is Colonel Jacques Baud. Colonel, as always, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back in your show. Thanks.
It's always a treat to have you on there, because it's always nice to be able to have somebody who understands reality and doesn't sugarcoat things. We need a whole lot more of that in the world today. Let's jump right in here. First, I want to show you that. So yesterday, after his United Nations Security Council speech 2 days ago, and then the UN General Assembly speech yesterday that Zelensky gave, which was kind of boilerplate, kind of nothing surprising or unusual about anything he said in there. But then the real heart of the whole issue of this trip was much more than giving speeches, was he wanted permission to use long-range weapons against Russia. And so the big meeting was supposed to be yesterday at the White House. And just before that meeting with Biden, he actually met with Vice President Kamala Harris, who had these things to say after that meeting.
There are some in my country who would force Ukraine to give up large parts of its sovereign territory, who would demand that Ukraine accept neutrality and would require Ukraine to forego security relationships with other nations. These proposals are the same of those of Putin. And let us be clear, they are not proposals for peace. Instead, they are proposals for surrender, which is dangerous and unacceptable.
Now, I guess to a certain extent, you can say, well, she kind of does have a point. It really is kind of a terms of surrender at this point, as opposed to what it could have been a lot longer ago. But what do you make of her contention, really, that no, some in this country, and of course she's meaning President Trump, some in this country say that, you have to give up territorial integrity of certain parts of your country in order to get peace, but this isn't peace. What do you say when you hear her say that?
Well, first of all, you have to remember that Ukraine, as it was created, the country of Ukraine in 1991, when it became independent, if you look at the constitution, it said clearly that it would have no foreign troops on its territory, and it would remain away from alliances that would be, let's say, adverse to Russia or that would lead to war. So, in fact, what we had, and by the way, this issue of neutrality although the word neutrality didn't appear in the Constitution in 1991, we have to be clear about that. But what Kamala Harris refers to, the status of neutrality, is in fact what Zelensky accepted in April 2022, as this agreement was almost signed. It was a draft agreement, obviously, that was signed between the two delegations. It was signed by the Ukrainian delegation. It was about to be signed by Russia, as Boris Johnson came in and said to Zelensky he had to withdraw its participation to the negotiation. So, meaning that it is not something totally exotic. By the way, that's a response to a concept that was developed in the OSCE, meaning that your security, you cannot elaborate or have a security at the expense of the security of somebody else. Meaning that joining NATO is one thing, but it cannot be at the expense of the neighbors of Ukraine. And that's something that the Russians have always said. It's a principle of the OSCE. It was also written in the Astana Declaration. And that's exactly the point that is, in fact, that the Russians are pointing out. And that's what, as I said, was discussed in March 2022. So it's not something that is totally unacceptable. It's just the problem today is just that the West is just noticing that it's losing the battle of the narrative. In fact, that's exactly that. And Joseph Borrell, the head of the External Action Service of the European Union, just said exactly these words in July 2022. At that time, he noticed already that the West was losing the battle of narrative, because it's not enough just to say that Ukraine is winning. The problem is you can claim it's winning, but what at the end, what is relevant is what happens on the battlefield. And in July 2022, that's exactly the point where, in fact, we had the first demilitarization of the Ukrainian army. I remind you that demilitarization was one of the two objectives stated by Vladimir Putin. And in June 2022, Zelensky said, we have no army anymore. From now on, we rely on the support from the West. And that's exactly the problem. So meaning that saying that Ukraine was winning at that point was a delusion, simply delusional.
And of course, that once they had some success later on in the fall of that year, then that just supercharged everybody to thinking, okay, now then we actually are winning, so we're going to win the war here. And I think that will turn out to have been one of the worst things to happen for Ukraine, because it gave them, and especially the West, a belief that, hey, they maybe can win. Let's give them more stuff.
Exactly.
It worked out very well.
That's exactly the problem. We went into a kind of a spiral that was absolutely pointless. We just drove Ukraine into the situation where it is now, because there was absolutely, in fact, the Ukrainian army was, if you allow the word, it was demilitarized about 4 times. The first time in May, June 2022. The second time because from May, June 2022 up to the end of 2022, the West, especially Eastern European countries, provided weapons from their old Warsaw Pact time storage. So old T-72s, D-20 howitzer, and this kind of thing. And all this equipment was exhausted at the end of 2022. And that's the time when General Zaluzhny came in The Economist and was requesting, I think he came to Washington to ask for M1 Abrams and all these new things. And from that point, I mean, end of November, December 2022, the West started to talk about providing Abrams, Leopard 2, Challenger 2, and things like that. And then this equipment was delivered in the spring 2023. It was used in this infamous counteroffensive of the early summer 2023. And all that was destroyed, and meaning that then you had, in autumn last year, you had all these new requests from Zelensky to provide new equipment. And today we have Zelensky coming again, because now he has all this equipment demilitarized once more in the Donbass area and in the Kursk area, because in the Kursk area they've poured so many armored vehicles, tanks, and all that, and that's not a terrain for armored warfare. It's not a terrain for maneuver warfare, and for that reason, all these armored equipment were destroyed very quickly.
Yeah, that is so unfortunate. Because there just isn't enough now to rearm them another time. And of course, every single one of those iterations you just mentioned also came with significant casualties and being killed of the people who did have training. And the number of people with experience keeps shrinking because they keep dying, and then they just keep throwing in more cannon fodder who's not even trained up. But so that's kind of the baseline here, is that the military capacity, the ability on the ground, which I'll talk about it a little bit more length later on, but let's stick with where we are here, Harris, because she says one other thing in that engagement with Zelensky, which I think is really, really important to point out here, because she's saying we can't stop helping Ukraine because of what Putin could do next.
History has shown us if we allow aggressors like Putin to take land with impunity, they keep going. And Putin could set his sights on Poland, the Baltic states, and other NATO allies.
Yeah. So is that right? Is she going to? Is Putin going to keep going? Is he going to take Poland? Is he going to take the Baltics? And the only thing holding him back right now is Ukraine.
Well, the thing is, when you wage war, and you as a military, you know that as I do, that when you plan an operation, when you go to war, when you start a military operation, you have an objective. You don't just fight just for the sake of fighting. You have an objective. Now, the problem is that by removing a part of the history that led to the 24th of February 2022, we give the impression, or the media gave the impression, that Putin is just fighting for the fun of fighting, and that he attacks Ukraine just because he wanted to attack Ukraine. Nobody tried to understand what were the real objectives. And that's why you have the narrative plays an enormous role in the whole conduct of this war from the Western side, because that requires to, when you remove all the objectives, then you can say whatever about it. For instance, when Lord Austin used to say that Putin wanted to reach or to take over Kiev in 3 days. The Russians have never said that. Nobody in Russia has never said that Kiev should be taken in 3 days. But this is pure Western invention. And by stating, because we state what kind of objective Russia has, then we can say it is defeated, or it is incompetent or unable to do that. So we never listen to the real objectives. And that's exactly the same thing with what Kamala Harris just said about a possible war in Europe. By the way, she's not the first one. You had also Polish officials and ministers saying that. Ursula von der Leyen has said that. And even Kaja Kallas, who will replace Josep Borrell at the head of the foreign external action of the EU. So it's not new. The problem is that the Russians have never said that. And by the way, you see the contradiction. During months and even years, our media or politicians have said that the Russians are totally incompetent. They don't have good officers. They don't have good equipment. They don't have enough tanks. They don't have enough drones. They don't have. Their missiles are exhausted and things like that. And now we are just portraying a Russia that wants to go beyond Ukraine, even if everybody says, well, they are so incapable that they're not even able to take over the whole of Ukraine. So we are in a totally disconnect here. The narrative is totally disconnected from the reality. First of all,
let me ask you this question, because I think that there's another aspect of what she said that may have been missed on a lot of people. She's claiming that we can't stop helping Ukraine because if we make a negotiated settlement or something, that Russia's going to roll west or so. But what do you say, militarily speaking, if we do continue to support Ukraine and they lose anyway, and now then you have a not just negotiated settlement, but a victorious Russian army that's, potentially right up on NATO countries, then what happens?
Well, it's very simple. And in fact, Sergei Lavrov said, I think it was last year, when it was first a question of providing long-range weapons, the ATACMS at that time, ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. And Lavrov said, he said, that's so. If you give weapons that can reach, that have 300 kilometers range, then we will move the battle line, the contact line, 300 kilometers west, so that the Ukraine cannot reach us. Meaning that if you, in this logic, they would say, if you give long-range weapons, let's say 1,000 kilometers, then we will make it in such a way that the battle line will move 1,000 kilometers west, meaning that basically we will destroy Ukraine. So this is what will happen. I mean, the more weapons we provide to Ukraine, will not provide a solution, because the thing is that all the weapons we provide, and that's very interesting that the Ukrainians themselves have said that, especially, for instance, as the French, Emmanuel Macron, proposed to provide Mirage 2000, those fighters, Mirage 2000 fighter aircraft to Ukraine. And that was last year. And the spokesperson or the spokesman of the Ukrainian Air Force said, well, we don't need those aircraft, because there will be more problem for us than a solution. Because then we will have need to have a separate logistical and supply line for these aircraft. We'll need special training for these specific aircraft, and so on and so forth. And the problem is that all the equipment we have provided to Ukraine, because these equipment were even coming from the 60s or the 70s, they were completely outdated and all that. They require training. They cannot be integrated in the modern command and control structures of Ukraine. As a result, we provided a lot of weapons, but all these weapons cannot be used within an operational consistency, if you want. And that's exactly what we have seen in Kursk, that you had all kind of tanks, Leopard 2, Challengers, M1, everything. All these tanks have different ammunition, for instance. They have different operational requirements. They have different abilities on the ground, meaning that how can you plan a battle with a kind of a patchwork of equipment? You cannot integrate them properly into your command and control system. That's the same with artillery and all that. They have all kind of different type of artillery pieces. I'm not mentioning rocket artillery, but even 152, 155. They have all these. All that complicates the command and control and the supply of your operations. And that's the weakness of the Ukrainians, meaning that we provide a lot of things, but at the end, the problem on the ground for the Ukrainians is to integrate that into something which is consistent to fight the Russians. On the other hand, the Russians do not have this problem, because everything they have has been tailor-made for this kind of warfare. I mean, in my book on the art of war, I explained also that the Leopard 2, for instance, very good tank, and I was in command of a Leopard 2 tank battalion. So I'm very happy with this equipment. But it's a type of equipment that is designed to fight in Central Europe with a slightly hilly terrain and things like this. It's not suited for the very flat type of terrain you have in Ukraine. As a result, you have a silhouette which is much higher for the Leopard 2, and it's more vulnerable to the T-90, for instance. If you look at the silhouette of those tanks, you will see that the T-90 is much lower on the ground, much harder to acquire as a target, and much harder to hit. So these equipment, some were very good, but not suited for the kind of warfare which is waged in Ukraine.
Okay, I want to go down a path that there you just kind of touched on, because this is something I don't see mentioned anywhere else, and you have kind of opened up a box here that I think people need to understand a little bit more, because it could be the genesis for some of these comments from Putin changing his nuclear doctrine, and specifically some of the criteria that he talked about for use in it. And most people in the West, most commentators think it's exclusively related to the idea that they're going to have long-range weapons from the Ukraine side shot into Russia. And certainly that's a big part of it, but I don't think it's the only part, and it might not even be the biggest part on their mind. Because you just talked about how Russia has previously said, and Putin earlier this year, I think many months ago, has said, because a lot of these attacks into Belgorod and some of these other places, that they were going to have a big buffer zone push back, a big buffer zone across the whole part of northern Ukraine here. In recent months, there has been more and more anecdotal information, videos of lots of trains of armored vehicles being transported, and reports of Russian forces outside of the contact, not on the contact line, either in Kursk, Kharkiv, or down on the Eastern Front, have been assembling in areas like around 200,000 to 300,000 of them in the north. Now, as we're talking about right now, the lines are so brittle all along that line. In fact, they're really starting to crumble at a faster rate in the Eastern Front or here over the last 5 or 6 weeks. If there is a big push from the north, they could legitimately break the lines and roll quite a bit of the far south. And then I think NATO is going to be at a real quandary, because mentally, I don't think anyone even thinks that's possible. And if Russia, with large formations, starts to actually, for example, put Kiev at risk, then there's going to be, I think, a fear, especially among the Baltics, Poland, etc., maybe Romania, that, oh, crap, we better do something. We better put some troops into Western Ukraine, or we're going to be coming next. Do you see any reality or any plausibility in that outcome?
Well, we cannot exclude the fact that Russia prepares a massive attack against let's say, the center part of Ukraine. My personal view is that Russia will try to avoid at any cost to enter the western part of Ukraine. For the simple reason is that this part is extremely nationalistic. And these guys are totally against Russian. If you look at what happened, for instance, in between February and April 2014, just after the new government, after the Maidan revolution, after toppling the President Yanukovych, the new non-elected government decided to change the status of the Russian language. And that prompted a massive uprising in the south of Ukraine. And you could see that this uprising was all in the southeastern part of Ukraine, but nothing happened in the western part. Meaning that for today, the region where the Russians are today is, in fact, if I can use that word, it's probably not totally appropriate, but it's their comfort zone, in the sense that the population in that area is not completely adverse to Russia. Doesn't mean that everybody will be happy to have the Russians instead of Ukraine. It's not what I'm saying. But by and large, the population in the southern and eastern part of Russia, of Ukraine, are more or less in favor of Russia. At least they are from Russian extraction and they could live with the Russians. But the western part, this is absolutely no way. And for that reason, I doubt personally that the Russians would try to enter the western part of.
Oh, yeah. And I'm sorry if I said that. I certainly didn't mean that at all. But I meant the northern and the eastern part in large numbers to have a big incursion and possibly take some of these major cities. That I think would be a real problem for many in the eastern flank to actually say, this is what we've been warning against the whole time. But that's why I say I think that may be tied to why Putin made this comment that they would consider that any non-NATO, non-nuclear and nuclear powers that were to strike into them, that they would consider using nuclear weapons to forestall anybody from coming in from NATO.
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure that the Russia has any intent to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The change
Right.
in the nuclear doctrine, in fact, was expected because you have to remember, and nobody, I think, noticed that in the West, but Joe Biden in April 2022 changed the US nuclear doctrine. And initially, as it was agreed during the Cold War, nuclear weapons were designed for deterrence only. And that was the so-called sole purpose. That was deterrence. And the two superpowers renounced to the first use of nuclear weapons. But apparently, Joe Biden changed, and you can see that on the website of the arms control website. I can give you the reference. But in April 2022, Joe Biden changed that doctrine and accepted the principle of first use. And that's from that point, we had discussion in Russia about the change of the nuclear doctrine, because the Russian nuclear doctrine is still based on the non-first use and the use of having nuclear weapons just for the sake of deterrence. And now this has changed because with the threat of using long-range weapons, and long-range weapons means that some, especially if you consider the JSAM missile and this kind of thing, they could reach St. Petersburg, they could reach Moscow and things like this, meaning that in essence, potentially, but if those weapons were allowed for the Ukrainians, they could potentially create an existential problem for the state, the institutions of Russia. And for that reason, that's probably the time point when Putin decided to change the doctrine. But this was expected, in fact, because
So that leads me to the next point there about the long-range weapons. Zelensky, his primary objective in coming here was to get authorization from Joe Biden to use long-range weapons. That's what he was been lobbying everyone for. Well, Biden actually spoke after their meeting, and he had a lot of positive things to say, but it's also important what he didn't say.
How is Ukraine going to prevail in this conflict? And I see two key pieces. First, right now we have to strengthen Ukraine's position on the battlefield. And that's why today I'm proud to announce a new $2.4 billion package of security assistance. I've also directed the Pentagon to allocate all the remaining security assistance funding that has been appropriated for Ukraine, period, by the end of my term, which is January 20. And this will strengthen Ukraine's position in future negotiations. Second, we look ahead to help Ukraine succeed in the long term. As you know better than anyone, as we said at the Washington summit, we have to support Ukraine in its path to membership to both the EU and to NATO, and continue to make reforms to counter corruption and strengthen democracy, which you're working mightily on right now. We have to ensure Ukraine has sufficient capabilities, and I mean sufficient capabilities, to defend against future Russian aggression.
Okay, so to me, Colonel, this is where we start to get into the really detached from reality issues here. So on the first end, he talks, the two things that he mentions are first, what you referred to just a second ago, another militarization of the Ukraine with a whole new equipment set, a bunch of stuff that's probably going to also be disconnected from, any kind of a system that you mentioned. But then he talked about, and long-term, to join NATO. Joining NATO was the casus belli for this war in the first place from the Russian side. So what you're telling Russia, you're signaling there is no reason for you to have a negotiated settlement, because their objective is to still try and have NATO come into Ukraine, which they would never accept. So I don't understand what Biden even thinks has a chance for a positive outcome in what he said here, in addition to not mentioning long-range weapons.
Well, the problem is, first of all, we have to understand that one of the specificity of this conflict, as I think the one which is currently going on in Palestine, Israel, this is the importance of the narrative. The narrative has become the centerpiece of warfare here. And when I hear Joe Biden in the sequence you just showed, my feeling is that he is just campaigning. I mean, it's not about Ukraine. It's about the campaign of Kamala Harris, in fact, because nobody thinks that what he has planned to provide to Ukraine will have any effect on the ground or will change the situation on the ground. And we have talked so much about game changers in this war. And in fact, none of these game changers have changed the game. But today, and we have seen that since the very beginning of this conflict, the narrative, in fact, we are talking about a war of narrative. And we are trying to convince ourselves that Ukraine can win. When even Joe Biden say Ukraine should prevail. But what does it mean concretely? What do we understand under the word prevail? In what sense? What is, and you remember a few weeks or months ago when Lloyd Austin was audited at the the Senate Committee for Armed Forces, when he was asked how he could define victory for Ukraine. He was not able to articulate a definition of victory because nobody knows what victory would mean for Ukraine. Does it mean retaking the Donbass? Does it mean destroying Russian forces? Does it mean staying in course? We don't have any clue on what this means. And my feeling is that we are in the West, we are just simply happy with the narrative. We say Ukraine will prevail. You know, I used, when I worked in NATO, I was involved in a project of building integrity in Ukraine. Building integrity essentially is about fighting corruption in the armed forces in particular. And I remember when I was talking to my colleagues of NATO, they said, "Well, this is desperate. We will never achieve the objective." And that was in 2014. You know, and today in wartime, where all the constraint of wartime, how can we figure out we would eradicate corruption in the next month? I mean, we didn't manage to do that in the last 10 years, and we want to do that in the next 6 months. It's totally delusional. But again, we are just happy with the narrative. In previous wars, the narrative was something that was supporting military action on the ground. But the essence of war was, in fact, what happened on the battlefield. Today, I have the feeling that for the West, the important is what we say, not what happens. And the important is that, and probably at one point, in order to have Zelensky signing an agreement with Russia, we'll just decide they have won. Somebody will say, oh, the fact that they resisted so strongly to the Russians is already a victory. And therefore, this is a victory, and therefore they can sign with the idea of victory. I feel we are going into this direction because this is the way we understand the war. It's interesting to see, for instance, we have European Union asking India not to use Russian oil. But at the same time, European Union increases its demand on Russian gas and oil. So it's a totally disconnect from reality. The importance is what we say, not what we do.
And let me ask you, what about the other half of that equation? Because obviously Russia has their own messaging, and that's, as you pointed out, even in previous wars, it's had a component. But is Russia focused on the message, or are they focused on the outcome on the ground?
Well, that's exactly the difference here. We have a kind of asymmetry because I tried to look, because everybody talked about the Russian disinformation and all that. And it's most probably that when they report on their battles and all that, it's most probable that the Russians will probably portray a more positive outcome of their actions. But when you look at what they say, and you look, let's say, like a couple of weeks or months later, you will notice that, in fact, they were quite honest in their reporting, meaning that on the Russian side, they put emphasis on the action on the ground, and the narrative is in support of what happens on the ground, as opposed to the Ukrainians, who used to say that they have a victory, that they defeated the Russians, that the Russians are dying on the battlefield and all that. Again, I have no figures, but I saw just yesterday a figure that's a Russian figure. So we have also to be careful about it. But based on experience, we see that those figures are rough, by and large, quite precise. But the figures said that during this 2.5 years, Ukraine lost 800,000 men. 800,000. And okay, that's both. These are casualties, meaning dead and wounded. I am not able to assess whether those figures are accurate or not. The experience tells us that basically we can trust these figures. But again, there is still a question mark. But the interesting thing is, and I tried to compare, for instance, the narrative of the Western media about Russian losses. And I noticed that, in fact, when I compared with Mediazona, which is a website that is run by the Russian opposition together with the British BBC, and they make kind of a count of Russian casualties. And when I compare the figures provided by Mediazona, and I compare them with what the media, the Western media says, there's a ratio of 1 to 10, meaning that even Mediazona, which is an opposition media, tends to give a figure which is 10 times lower than what our media in the West say. So, meaning that we tend to exaggerate in multiplying by 10 the casualties, the Russian casualties, and we try at the same time to minimize the Ukrainian casualties.
Right, which seems to line up what you say about we're more interested in the narrative about what's going on. But what you can't do is ignore away the fact that Russia on the ground continues to take piece of land after piece of land, city after city, and they're moving forward. That's not a myth. It's not a myth that Ukraine failed in their offensive. You can't hide those things.
Absolutely, and that's an interesting thing, because note what we have witnessed in the last couple of months. More and more censorship everywhere, in the US, in Europe. We had social networks censored. That's very strong in Europe, by the way. You had this case with the CEO of Telegram, the Telegram channel, which is quite widely used in Russia and Ukraine, by the way. And it's interesting that it comes now, because what we are witnessing today is that the reality on the ground is reaching a point that it confronts the false narrative. And we see now that, in fact, everything we have said in the last 2 years was simply false. And all the assumptions we made, all the assessment we made were totally false. Remember, even Nord Stream, even a French general on the French TV, as he was asked who is responsible for the bombing of Nord Stream, he said without hesitating 1 single second, it is Russia. And today we are talking about the possibility that it could be Ukraine. So, meaning that we have to today, those days, and that will probably become even more obvious in the coming months and weeks, that the narrative collides with the reality. And we see that the two don't match. And that's exactly what's happening. And that's also in the US, I have to be honest also with the even media such as New York Times or Washington Post, they start to acknowledge that the narrative that they had before was not exactly was not matching the reality. Yeah. They tend to be a little bit more honest. But in Europe, this is absolutely not the case. They still stick to a narrative which is totally disconnected from the reality. And for that reason, we have people, they have been, today it's probably less obvious with Ukraine and the Ukrainian conflict. It's more obvious with Palestine. But people who said that, for instance, Israeli did this or that, or the Palestinian didn't do that, they were arrested.
Yeah. So, and I want to jump back to the United States here on the shifting narrative part. So I just showed you what the candidate Kamala Harris and President Biden have been saying here, but the other half of Zelensky's veil is probably a little bit bigger on the Republican side. Back during the debate between Harris and Trump a few weeks back, President Trump was asked, do you want Ukraine to win? And he kind of, well, he didn't really waffle. He just said, he didn't answer the question. He just said, I want the war to be over. So it definitely wasn't pro-Ukraine. Well, that's actually a little stronger now in the negative sense. When at a campaign rally a couple of days ago, he said this.
Biden and Kamala got us into this war in Ukraine, and now they can't get us out. They can't get us out. I watched him. We will win. We will. He's been saying that for 3 years. But we're stuck in that war unless I'm president. I'll get it done. I'll get it negotiated. I'll get out. We got to get out. Biden says, we will not leave until we win. What happens if they win? That's what they do, is they fight wars. As somebody told me the other day, they beat Hitler, they beat Napoleon. That's what they do, they fight.
So that's what he said a couple of days ago. Today, he actually met with Zelensky. This is the last stop of his diplomatic tour here, and he didn't exactly get the ringing endorsement he was looking for. So I'm going to show you a series of clips here because there's something important in each one of them, and try to pay attention to the facial expressions, really, of both men as one and then the other makes comments here, and it's really awkward. Here's the first one.
We're going to work very much with both parties to try and get this settled and get it worked out. It has to end at some point. It has to end. He's gone through hell, and his country has gone through hell like few countries have ever. Like it's happened anywhere. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. It's a terrible situation.
So he first of all didn't say, yes, I'm going to keep helping you. He just said it has to end. And you see Zelensky sitting there going, yeah, I don't want it to end like that. But so what do you think on that first one?
Well, the problem is that, Zelensky is totally delusional, but probably, and that was, by the way, that was said, I think it was the Washington Post. I think it was end of last year already. They said that he was delusional. And, in an op-ed also. But
yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the problem is that since the beginning of this war, Zelensky is stuck into his narrative. He cannot, and probably also because of the pressure behind him, because I feel, and I'm not the only one, who feel that they are individual force, let's put it that way. Probably that's the Ukrainian deep state, or you can call it different ways, but they will not allow Zelensky to find a negotiated solution for that. Some people, and probably there are some historical explanation for that, but they contemplate a fight like Berlin, May 1945, and something like that. And they will not allow Zelensky to find a solution. And this is probably that doesn't represent the totality of the population, because we have within Ukraine a very strong resistance movement that develops. I mean, armed resistance that develops within Ukraine. I mean, within the western part of Ukraine. And for that reason, I think the various forces that antagonize within Western Ukraine are extremely strong. And Zelensky, I think, and probably he realized that there is a point where he has to find, that's a reason why he tries to find this victory plan or something, which at the end of the day points at something not negotiated, but discussed somehow. But
Right.
on the other hand, the nature of the victory plan is such that it doesn't allow for discussion, because it's not designed to allow a real dialogue with Russia. It's something that they want to impose to Russia. So.
Right. And in fact, on that, that's one of the other things she said. And again, this was literally just less than an hour ago, I think, before we started this session here. Now, watch Zelensky's going to speak in this one here and knows what he says about Putin.
I think we have a common view that the war in Ukraine has to be stopped and Putin can't win and Ukrainians have to prevail. And I want to discuss with you the details of our plan of victory.
So he says, we want to talk, but Putin can't prevail. He didn't say lose anymore, but he says he can't prevail. And you see Trump kind of going, yeah, about that.
Well, that's the problem. The question, I think the question whether Ukraine will lose or Russia will win, this is not a question, because that's exactly what will happen. The question is how and when. How will Ukraine lose, or how will Russia win, and when it will happen? That's, I think, the only question, because if we had stopped this in early April 2022, we know exactly what this could have happened. I mean, the Russian would have withdrawn from Ukraine. Ukraine would be kind of neutral and things like that. Today, we know that that will not happen anymore. The Russians today, they say, okay, you missed the train. The train is gone. And so if we have a discussion, this will be based on the situation on the ground, which is totally different. And everybody knows that. And I think militarily, we understand that it cannot be otherwise. What could be done to force Russia to remove its forces from Ukraine? I mean, unless there is a massive war from the whole of NATO in Ukraine to repel Russia, and I'm not even sure they would succeed in that, but that's another topic. It's in kind of a fiction, but as we see the battlefield today, we don't see how Putin cannot prevail. He will prevail. The question is if he wants to prevail big or prevail small, if I can put it that way. You understand? And that's exactly where the West is completely entangled into the narrative, because
speaking of the narrative in the West, I want to show you one additional clip here, because we've shown you politicians, and politicians can make all kinds of statements, and very rarely are they actually connected with any truth. But Francis Fukuyama has for a long time been regarded as one of the elite of the Western thinkers and strategic thinkers, etc. And he was interviewed a day or two ago in Kiev, and had what I thought a very peculiar view on things, with someone who has the reputation of actually seeing things as they are. Watch his comment here about the negotiated settlement, and I think you'll still see another disconnect with reality here. Watch this.
I don't think that you're going to have a kind of 1945 victory where Ukraine marches into Moscow and Putin is, kills himself. I mean, that's not going to happen. And I also think that, the ability of Ukraine to liberate the whole of the 1991, territorial extent is going to be very difficult at this point. And but I also don't see politically it being possible for any Ukrainian leader to actually sign a peace agreement that gives away 1 inch of Ukrainian territory. So, I think realistically what we're talking about are the conditions for a ceasefire, not a peace agreement. And that's a very complicated thing because I do think you can have a situation where you do have a ceasefire, but you actually don't agree to territorial losses. And, that's, I think, really what we ought to be thinking about.
And so part of it makes a lot of sense. He's like, okay, Ukraine's never going to go and militarily defeat Russia. And politically, for the same thing you said, that it's maybe really hard for Zelensky to have a negotiated settlement that he wants, because of his people there. But then he suggests maybe it's possible to have a ceasefire where we just can call it whatever we want. But while that might play in the West, because to your point earlier, we care about the narrative more than we care about what actually happened on the ground. But for that war to work, Putin has to play along. And why would he agree to anything that he just described there?
No, and that's precisely the point. And the Russians have said that many times. They don't want a ceasefire. They don't want a Korean solution. They want a solution, period. I mean, the conflict must end, period. And that means that we should have an agreement that ends the conflict, not an agreement that freezes the conflict. But I know that that's what the Americans are aiming at. And that's also the reason why, by the way, the fact that Ukraine entered Russia in Kursk, that excluded any possibility of ceasefire, even in the American way of understanding, because how can we imagine the Russians to freeze the conflict if you still have Ukrainian forces on Russian territory? That will not happen. They want first to repel the Ukrainian forces out of Russian territory before having any kind of negotiation. They will never accept a solution that freezes the presence of Ukrainian force on Russian territory. So that's absolutely clear. And that's the reason why, as soon as the Ukrainians entered the Kursk Oblast, the Russians said, well, for now it's out of question to talk, because first we push the Ukrainians back, then we can start again to talk about negotiation. And that's exactly what will happen. And then if there's a negotiation, the negotiation will be based on the actual status of force on the ground, meaning that the Ukrainians, they had their chance to have a solution where the Russians would get out of the Ukrainian territory. And that's what was agreed or half agreed in March or April 2022. But this, as I said before, this is gone. And today the Russians have consistently said this will be based on the actual situation on the ground and the precondition to entering negotiation. So it's not what the result of negotiation, but to enter negotiation, the Russian forces must have the control over the whole of the oblast of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson.
So let me ask you this. Last question on this part here. If we maintain our current trajectory, and especially if Kamala Harris wins the election here, because then there'll be a status quo sustaining on the policies of the United States. Obviously, it would be different with Trump. But if they maintain this focus here and they maintain this whole delusional outlook and looking for the narrative, and Russia's obviously not, they're going to continue on with what they're doing on the ground. How does this end?
Well, the thing is that the Russians will continue to grind down not just the Ukrainian forces, but probably Ukraine as a whole, meaning that they will certainly destroy the military potential. They might enter at one point Odessa and this part. That's possible. I don't know, but they will certainly make sure that Ukraine will not be a viable state somehow. So the industry will be destroyed, and that's what they've started to do with destroying the energy supply system. They will continue to, and you know, today a lot of Ukrainians, they would like to get out of the country. They are simply not allowed to do so. But today everybody understands that Ukraine is not a viable state anymore. It's a state that lives on a war economy, and it's sustained from the outside. But there is a point where this support will probably will not be possible anymore because it will be too expensive. And that's exactly what the Russian will do. If we don't stop it now, the Russian will just grind down the whole of Ukraine.
Do you see any possibility that Russia doesn't have the capacity to do what you said?
Well, they do have. I mean, again, they will avoid to occupy militarily the western part. That's my take. I mean, again,
right. So the bottom line is, if the West maintains its current focus of the narrative over the ground truth reality, then the almost certain consequence is going to be that more Ukrainians will die, more territory will be lost, and in the end, Russia will militarily prevail to one degree or another.
And the Ukraine will be economically destroyed. Simple.
Yeah, not a very pretty picture. Not a very good outcome for Western ideals and morals and values that we claim to uphold. But I guess we'll see what happens next, and especially even with the election, because that could actually change some things for Ukraine, ultimately for the better. Before I let you go today, I want to ask you real quick about the situation going on in the Middle East, with Israel apparently poised right on the edge of launching a ground incursion. There was a massive explosion in Beirut just a little bit ago. And according to some reports that are coming out, there is the possibility that Hassan Nasrallah was actually killed. And apparently this was his headquarters where they think that he was stationed. And there are some rumors that he either was wounded or possibly even killed. We'll see. It's all breaking news right now. But what do you think happens with this here? Because it looks to me like Israel is already in the process with all these airstrikes and the pagers and the assassinations of the senior leaders, that they are already in the process of going in on the ground. They're just waiting to start. How do you see it?
Well, if Israel starts to have a ground operation on the southern Lebanon, this will happen as it did in 2006. You know, the Hezbollah is a defensive, basically, it's a resistance organization in the true sense of the word, meaning that they are prepared for defense against a possible occupation, that the tunnels, trenches, blockhouses, and things like this. So, meaning that as it happened in 2006, if the Israeli comes into Lebanon, they will face a situation that will be probably even harsher than what they have found in Gaza. And since they were not very successful in Gaza, I suspect they might have also some kind of, you can call it probably defeat. I don't want to use these words because we don't know what will happen, but it might have, they might have very hard encounters with the Hezbollah. In addition to that, we have to remember that some Iraqi militias, Shia militias, because Iraq is essentially, has a very large Shia minority, they have claimed having 40,000 combatants ready to help the Hezbollah if Israel would enter South Lebanon. You have also Syrian militias have claimed they would come back and try to recover the Golan, because the Golan Heights are, in fact, from an international law point of view, it's still a Syrian territory. It's an occupied territory. It's a Syrian territory, and the Syrian militias would take advantage of the incursion to trying to recover the Golan. Meaning that, again, I cannot anticipate what the outcome of the operation could be, but I think Israel will have a very, very hard time in southern Lebanon, because the Hezbollah, don't forget that Hezbollah has been fighting the ISIS in Syria. They are very much battle hardened. They have a command and control structure that allow them to conduct operations, even if they don't have. They're not very strong in terms of armored vehicles, and they are not prepared for maneuver warfare. But when it comes to defensive warfare based on static installation and tunnels, exactly what we have seen in Gaza, I think they are very strong. And my view is that Israel might have a very hard time. Some say that if Israel enters South Lebanon, that could be the end point for Israel. I'm not that pessimistic because the resources of Israel are quite important, but they will certainly lose a lot of political and military prestige in such operation, in my view.
And now it seems that my assessment is that unless the United States gets sucked in and goes in and fights with Israel, I think that the stated objective, which from a number of Israeli leaders has been specifically to push Hezbollah back to the Litani River, which is like 25 kilometers or so, depending on where you measure it. That just seems like an incredibly difficult military task with the current size of the IDF, when they haven't been able to completely vanquish Hamas in 11 months in the relatively tiny Gaza Strip.
I fully agree with you, and I wondered if that is even possible. The Israelis never managed to have full control of the South Lebanon. In fact, they never managed that. In fact, even because of their presence, Hezbollah was created.
Right.
So meaning that they never managed to have any control of South Lebanon. As of today, the buffer zone is in fact on Israeli territory, because Israelis had to withdraw civilians from the border area. And in fact, Hezbollah has managed to create some kind of buffer zone on Israeli territory, if you want. So meaning that it will certainly be very very hard and very similar to what we have seen in Gaza, with a lot of destruction. And remember that in 2006, Israel made also a lot of destructions in South Lebanon. And that was even condemned by the international community. That will probably be even tougher this time. And the problem is that in this context, you might have the US coming along, but I don't see the US putting really boots on the ground. I don't know, but I don't know what is the status of planning. My personal view is that if the US would be involved, that's probably with the air war. I mean, kind of airstrikes, anti-missile things, and this kind of thing. But I'm not sure the Pentagon is ready to really put units on the ground. Probably,
I'm sure they're not. Definitely, the American people are not. But
exactly.
But this may be another one of those situations that is divorced from reality. So we'll see how this plays out.
That's true. We remember that in Ukraine, in fact, the only red lines that were crossed by the West. I mean, these were Western red lines that were crossed by the West. Right. The only red line that the Russians, in fact, defined was the question of the long-range strikes, and long-range missiles. But for the rest, all the other red lines. Like, remember that we talked about the equipment the end of 2022.
Yeah.
Remember that the U.S. Biden was not so keen providing M1 Abrams to the Ukrainians, and the UK came first, saying that they would provide a Challenger 2, and then Joe Biden changed his mind and then came along.
Yeah.
So we might have this kind of behavior also for Israel. But the situation is also a little bit different, because the kind of warfare which could be waged in South Lebanon is much harder somehow. And I'm not sure that the U.S. Let's say population is ready to accept this kind
I'm
of thing.
sure they're not, actually, but we'll see if the politicians catch up to our population very soon. But listen, I won't hold you up any further. I appreciate you coming on today. Great stuff on both of these breaking issues that are happening right now. We really appreciate you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And we appreciate you guys too. As always, ask that you like and subscribe. And also remind you that we are now on podcast. So go anywhere you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Be sure and type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You'll have to type that whole thing in there, but once you do, you will be in the podcast universe. Be sure to follow that and share it with your friends so that other people can benefit from this, even if they can't watch a video. Thank you very much, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.